The little girl's voice barely rose above the wind. She tugged at her mother's coat sleeve with both hands, the way a child does when they know something is wrong but cannot name it. The sky above them was the color of ash. The field around them was the color of rust. And the rusted iron hatch in the ground before them looked like something the earth had tried to swallow and then given up on. "Why are we here, Mom?" the girl asked again, louder this time. Because her mother hadn't answered the first time. Her mother, Diana Calloway, 34 years old, hadn't answered because she didn't have an answer that made sense. Not yet. Not one she could give to a 7-year-old who needed certainty more than she needed the truth. What Diana had was a single sheet of paper, a certificate of sale, a government surplus auction receipt stamped in faded red ink. And at the bottom of that receipt, in a box labeled purchase price, a number that had seemed like a joke when she first saw it, and had seemed even more like a joke the second and third times she read it. $1. She had purchased this property, this hatch in the ground, this forgotten concrete lung buried beneath the Oklahoma flatlands, for a single dollar. She didn't fully understand how. She didn't fully understand why. But she had the paper in her hand, and she had her daughter beside her, and she had nothing else anywhere else in the world, and so here they were. She put her hand on her daughter's shoulder. Her name was Maisie. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw, and she'd been wearing the same pair of sneakers for 9 months because Diana hadn't been able to afford new ones. The soles were starting to peel at the toe. Diana noticed this now, as she noticed it every day, and she pushed the guilt down to the place she kept all the guilt, on that compressed and pressurized place somewhere behind her sternum that she never let herself think about for too long. "This is ours," Diana said. She said it the way she said things she wasn't fully sure of, but needed to be true. "We're going to figure it out." To understand how a woman and her daughter end up standing in the middle of a dead Oklahoma field, staring at a rusted iron hatch in the ground, you have to go back. You have to go back almost 3 years to a morning in Tulsa, when Diana Calloway woke up in the apartment she'd shared with her husband for 6 years, and found that he was gone. Not gone the way people are gone when they leave for work early. Gone the way people are gone when they've been planning to leave for a long time and have simply chosen not to tell you. His clothes were gone. His truck was gone. The joint savings account, the one Diana had contributed to faithfully for 5 years, the one that held $22,000 they were saving to eventually buy a house, was gone. What was not gone was the lease, signed in both their names, with 4 months remaining, and a landlord who did not accept personal circumstances as legal tender. Diana had worked since she was 15. She'd waitressed through high school and into community college before life got in the way of finishing her degree. She'd worked at a call center, then at a grocery chain, then at a distribution warehouse outside of Tulsa, where she packed shipping boxes on a 10-hour shift that started at 4 in the morning. She wasn't someone who expected things to be easy. She wasn't someone who'd ever thought of herself as fragile. But the disappearance of Marcus Calloway had been more than a personal betrayal. It had been a structural collapse. The kind of loss that doesn't just hurt, but dissolves the architecture of a life. She'd built everything around a shared plan, and when one person withdrew from the plan without warning, the whole thing had no foundation left to stand on. She'd held on in the apartment for 2 months, pulling double shifts at the warehouse, asking her mother for help. She knew her mother couldn't give, selling the furniture piece by piece on Facebook Marketplace until the apartment looked like a photograph of someone else's abandoned life. Then came the eviction notice. Then came the short-term motel on the east side of Tulsa, where she and Maisie shared a single room with a broken window she covered with a piece of cardboard, and a bathroom she cleaned herself every morning because the maid service had long since stopped showing up. Then came the realization, arriving slowly, And then, all at once, the way terrible realizations always do, that she was not temporarily between situations. She was homeless. She and her daughter were homeless. So a fact so enormous and so impossible to look at directly that she could only approach it sideways, in small increments, like looking at an eclipse. The warehouse job had lasted until April of the second year, when the company announced a restructuring and eliminated her shift category entirely. She found part-time work at a gas station, then at a fast food restaurant, then both at once. She was working 60 hours a week and still couldn't afford a security deposit on an apartment because every place that would rent to her in their price range required first and last month up front, and she could never quite accumulate the deposit without spending it on food or Maisie's school supplies or the motel bill. She was running, always running, on a track that was set up specifically to ensure she could never quite reach the finish line. She knew this. She understood the system well enough to see its shape clearly. Understanding it didn't change it. It was during this period, the period she would later call the gray time, because everything about it felt muted and exhausted and colorless, that she started going to the county surplus auctions. Not because she had money to spend. She had almost nothing to spend. But the auctions were free to attend, and they were indoors. And on Saturdays, when Maisie was with her school friend Lily, Diana would sit in the folding plastic chairs of the Creek County Public Services Building and watch other people buy other people's abandoned things and feel for a few hours like she was part of a world that had order to it, that had rules she could follow and outcomes she could predict. It was a comfort that cost nothing, which was the only kind of comfort she could afford. She'd been to perhaps a dozen auctions before the one that changed everything. She almost hadn't gone that day, why she had a headache, and the sky outside looked like it wanted to become weather. She was sitting in the motel room watching Maisie color a picture of a horse when she thought, almost involuntarily, that she needed to get out, that she needed to be somewhere with other people, that if she sat in that room for one more afternoon, listening to the highway noise, she was going to lose some essential piece of herself that she couldn't afford to lose. The Creek County surplus auction that afternoon had the usual inventory. Filing cabinets, obsolete office equipment, a lot of items that appeared to have been sitting in a government warehouse since a decade before Diana was born. She sat in the third row and watched things go for $10 and $20, and once, briefly, $400 for a riding lawnmower that looked like it still worked. And then the auctioneer had reached item number 47, and he had described it in the same flat, efficient voice he used for everything. And what he described had lodged in Diana's brain like a splinter. Federal government surplus. Parcel 7 of the Cold War decommissioning inventory, Creek County subsection. One underground civil defense shelter, constructed 1961, concrete reinforced, approximately 2,000 square feet total footprint. Located on parcels 118B through 118D of the county survey grid, Osage Township road access, with full mineral rights, included in deed transfer. Starting bid, $1. There had been a silence in the room after that. Not a surprised silence, an indifferent silence, the silence of people who have heard a strange item and have already decided it doesn't concern them. Someone in the back had laughed. 2 people pulled out their phones. The auctioneer had looked around the room with the patience of a man who has seen every variety of human non-response. $1, he said again. Do I have $1? Diana had raised her hand. She didn't know why. She would think about this later, in the months that followed, lying awake in the dark of the bunker, listening to her daughter breathe. And she would try to reconstruct the logic of that moment. There wasn't logic. There was something more like instinct, or desperation wearing instinct's clothing. She had $1. She had, literally, a single dollar bill folded in the front pocket of her jeans, that she had been saving to buy a bottle of water from the vending machine in the lobby. She raised her hand, and no one else raised theirs, and the auctioneer said, "Sold," and Diana Calloway became the owner of a Cold War bunker buried somewhere in the Creek County flatlands for the price of a bottle of water she never got to drink. The logistics had taken 2 weeks to sort out. The county clerk's office had been mildly startled to process the transfer. Apparently, the property had been sitting in the surplus inventory for 11 years without a buyer, and the clerk, a round-faced woman named Brenda, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, had needed to locate 3 different forms that hadn't been used in some time. The deed was in order. The mineral rights were clean. Diana had stood in the county office holding Maisie's hand and signed document after document, and at no point did anyone ask her where she was living or how she intended to use the property, and she had offered no information of her own because she had not yet made a decision about any of it. She'd driven out to look at it 2 days after the papers cleared, borrowing her co-worker Tamara's car for the afternoon. She hadn't brought Maisie. She'd navigated by the parcel coordinates and pulling off a county road onto a dirt access track and driving slowly through scrub grass and low red-brown brush until the track ended at what appeared to be nothing, just a flat, brownish field running out to a tree line a half-mile away. She'd gotten out of the car and stood in the silence and the wind, and eventually found the hatch. A round iron door set into a low concrete collar rising about 8 inches from the ground, painted at some point in military green, the paint now mostly gone, so the iron beneath it orange and brown with decades of rust. A heavy padlock, original government issue, old enough that she hadn't even known such thick, heavy padlocks existed, held it shut. The key had been in an envelope with the deed papers. She'd stood there for a long time looking at the hatch. Then she'd gotten back in the car and driven back to the motel. She'd needed time to think. What she'd thought over the following days was this. She had no other options. The motel was draining what little she managed to save. She was going nowhere and going there fast. She had a piece of property that was legally hers, the first thing she had owned in 3 years that was fully, unambiguously, legally hers. And it had 4 walls and a floor and a ceiling. And if it had a way to manage ventilation, and if it wasn't structurally compromised, and if she could make it livable, even barely livable, then it was more than she had now. That was the math. That was the entire calculation. It was not romantic. It was not exciting. It was the arithmetic of someone with no margin for error, choosing the only option that kept the numbers from going negative. She'd gone back 3 more times on her own before she brought Maisie. She had a flashlight, a decent one, an LED she'd bought at the dollar store, and a pry bar she'd borrowed from Tamara's garage. And on the second visit, she'd managed to work the key into the padlock and turn it and feel the mechanism give, that deep, satisfying chunk of metal surrendering after years of resistance. The hatch itself had taken both hands and most of her body weight to open. It had swung up and back with a sound that she imagined could have been heard from a considerable distance, a grinding, metallic exhalation, as if the earth itself had been holding its breath. The smell that had come up at her was remarkable. It was dry. That was the first thing, unexpectedly dry, when she had expected damp and mold and rot. It smelled of concrete and metal and time. It smelled the way very old enclosed spaces smell when they've been sealed away from the world long enough that the world has forgotten about them. It smelled like the absence of human presence rather than its decay, which felt different in a way she couldn't quite articulate, but which she found less threatening than she'd expected. She'd stood at the top of the concrete steps, leading down into the dark for almost a full minute before she stepped through. The stairs were solid. 12 steps down to a landing, then a sharp right turn, then a short corridor, and then a room. She'd swept the flashlight around, and what she saw was this. A room roughly the size of a large suburban living room, with a low concrete ceiling and concrete walls and a concrete floor, all of it dry and structurally sound as far as she could determine. Along one wall, metal shelving units, empty. Along another, what appeared to be a communications station, an old radio setup, panel switches, gauges, that was obviously non-functional but structurally intact. In the center of the room, bolted to the floor, 2 metal desks of the government surplus variety, scarred with age but solid. In the corner, on a small bathroom partition, a chemical toilet, non-functional, and a metal sink connected to nothing. And at the far end of the room, a second door. It wasn't the hatch style, it was a proper door, metal, institutional, painted the same faded military green as the outside hatch. It had a different kind of lock, a heavy lever handle, and what appeared to be a secondary security latch bolted across it, the kind of additional locking mechanism that somebody had added at some point after the original construction. She'd tried the keys on her ring. None of them fit the secondary latch. She'd noted this, filed it away, and spent the rest of her time on that visit, measuring the main room and taking photographs on her phone and calculating what it would cost in basic materials to make the space habitable enough to sleep in. The answer, as it turned out, was less than she expected. She was not starting from zero. The concrete structure was sound. She had Tamara's neighbor, a retired construction worker named Gary, come out and look at it in exchange for a case of beer. And he'd walked the walls and ceiling with his knuckles and his practiced eye, and told her it had been built to last 100 years, and was maybe halfway through that lifespan, with plenty to spare. The ventilation system, a series of manual air intake pipes rising to ground level, capped with filters that were decades old, but still partially functional, was sufficient for habitation if she replaced the filter elements, which were available at a hardware store for $12. The moisture barrier appeared intact. There was no evidence of water infiltration or structural cracking. She'd spent 6 weeks preparing the bunker before she moved them in, working every spare hour she had outside of her 2 jobs. She dragged a small generator down the steps and rigged temporary lighting, a string of LED shop lights she'd found at a salvage store for $20. She'd found used cots at a thrift shop and carried them down on her back. She'd bought secondhand camping supplies, a propane burner, a water storage container, a basic set of cookware. She'd replaced the ventilation filters. She'd scrubbed every surface with bleach and then scrubbed it again. She'd spread foam rubber mats on the floor sections where they would sleep. She'd brought down a battery-powered lantern and a small stack of Maisie's books. She'd done all of this without telling Maisie what she was doing, because she wasn't sure Maisie could process it yet, and she wasn't sure she could explain it in a way that didn't sound like surrender. She'd told her daughter the week before they moved in. They'd been sitting in the motel room eating sandwiches she'd made from a loaf of bread and a package of deli turkey, and she'd turned off the television and sat across from Maisie and explained it as plainly and calmly as she could. She'd said they were going to live somewhere new. She'd said it was unusual, and it would take some getting used to, but that it was theirs, completely theirs, and no one could make them leave. Maisie had listened with the grave, not careful attention of a child who has already learned that adult conversations about moving and change require serious consideration. She had asked several questions. She had asked if there would be a bathroom, and Diana had said yes, not yet fully working, but getting there. She had asked if there would be a place for her books, and Diana had said absolutely. She had asked if they would still be able to get to school, and Diana had said yes, for no, she had already figured out the route on the county bus system. And then Maisie had eaten the rest of her sandwich and looked out the window for a moment and said, "Okay." That had made Diana cry, privately, in the bathroom, with the water running so Maisie wouldn't hear. The okay had broken something open in her. Not the sadness. She'd been carrying the sadness for so long, it had become structural, had become part of how she was built. But what it had broken open was something smaller and more precise, a grief she hadn't quite let herself feel. The grief for the childhood Maisie deserved and wasn't getting. The grief for the fact that her daughter's response to being told they were going to live in an underground military bunker was to ask about her books and then say, okay, because Maisie had learned, at 7 years old, to be adaptable to things children shouldn't have to be adaptable to. And that was the loss that made her weep with the water running. Not her own hardship, her daughter's premature capability. She dried her face and come back out and finished her own sandwich and told Maisie they would go see it together on Saturday. Which was how they came to be standing in a dead Oklahoma field, Maisie's hand in Diana's hand, looking at an iron hatch in the ground, and why Diana couldn't answer the question. Why are we here, Mom? With anything but the incomplete truth. This is ours. We're going to figure it out. She unlocked the hatch. The mechanism gave the same way it had the first time, that deep, surrendering chunk. And she lifted it with the same effort, swinging it back and leaving it open against its built-in stop rod. The steps were lit now, the LED shop lights casting a pale, even glow down the stairwell. She went first, one hand on the concrete wall, and Maisie followed with her hand on the railing Diana had bolted in on her third preparation visit, a simple pipe rail that she'd mounted at child height, specifically for this moment. She heard Maisie's sneakers on the concrete steps, careful and deliberate. She heard her daughter's breathing. She heard the wind cut off as they descended, and the silence of the earth close in around them. At the bottom, Diana watched Maisie's face. She had positioned the lights specifically for this moment. She'd thought about it. The main room was illuminated with the warm-leaning LED strips she'd sourced after deciding the blue-white shop lights were too clinical, too institutional. She'd brought down a small second-hand rug for the sleeping area, and Maisie's drawings, the horse pictures, and the rainbow pictures, and the picture of the three of them that Maisie had drawn from memory, and which included Marcus even now, were pinned to the one section of wall she'd covered with a corkboard panel bought at a school supply sale. Maisie turned a slow circle. She looked at the corkboard with her pictures. She looked at the cots, and the foam mats, and the small propane stove, and the container of water, and the shelf Diana had built from salvaged lumber and loaded with their books. She looked at the metal desks and the old communication panels and the ceiling and the floor. She looked at the door at the far end of the room, the one with the lock Diana hadn't been able to open yet. "What's in there?" Maisie asked. "I don't know yet," Diana said. "I haven't been able to open it." Maisie nodded, processing. "Are we going to find out?" "Yes," Diana said. "Eventually." Maisie walked to her cot and sat on it, and bounced once, experimentally. She picked up the lantern from the shelf, and clicked it on, and held it, and looked around the room in its light. Then she said, with a pragmatism that broke Diana's heart all over again, "It's not that bad, Mom." "No," Diana agreed. "It's not that bad." They moved in on a Tuesday. The county school bus route had a stop 3/4 of a mile from the access track, which meant Diana walked Maisie to the road at 7:15 each morning and met her there at 3:45 each afternoon. She continued her 2 jobs, the early shift at the gas station and the evening shifts at the restaurant, using the money she was no longer paying for the motel room to slowly improve their situation. She bought a proper chemical toilet with adequate ventilation. She found a used camping shower system and rigged it with a water heating coil she had a plumber friend of Tamara's install for a small favor. She ran an extension cord from the generator to a power strip and arranged a small study area for Maisie near the desk. She bought a second-hand tablet so Maisie could do her homework and have some kind of window to the world above. The locked door remained locked for the first month. Diana passed it every day. She looked at it and she thought about it, and she added it to her mental list of problems to address when she had time, which she categorized as eventually. The key she needed wasn't on any ring she'd been given. She'd asked the county clerk's office twice, and both times had been told that the inventory had transferred complete, and there was nothing additional on file. She'd thought about calling a locksmith and decided she didn't have the money. She'd thought about trying to drill the secondary latch herself and decided she didn't have the equipment or the skill. So she had left it. The door had been locked for decades. It could remain locked a little longer. It was Maisie who changed the timeline. It was a Saturday afternoon, 7 weeks into their underground life. Diana was at the small desk, doing the arithmetic of their finances, a calculation she performed every Saturday with the same combination of hope and dread, looking for the margin that might eventually allow them to move to a small apartment, trying to find a corner she hadn't yet thought to cut. Maisie was on her cot reading, and had been reading quietly for over an hour, which was long enough that Diana noticed the quality of the silence and looked over. Maisie was not reading. She was sitting with her book open in her lap and her eyes on the locked door. She'd been looking at it for a while, Diana realized. Looking at it with an expression Diana recognized as her own. That frontal, patient, methodical look she wore when she was working through a problem. "I think there's a key," Maisie said, and Diana set down her pencil. "We've been through the keys, sweetheart." "Not those keys," Maisie said. "I mean, I think there's a key here. In the room." Diana looked around the room. She had cleaned it so thoroughly, inventoried it so carefully. She knew every corner, every shelf, every inch of the communication panel on the wall. "Where?" she asked, because Maisie's certainty had a quality to it she'd learned to take seriously. Maisie got up and walked to the communication panel on the wall. The panel was a large board of switches and gauges and labeled indicators, all dead, all non-functional, all original to 1961. Diana had looked at it many times because it was visually arresting in a certain industrial way, like looking at the instrument panel of a very old aircraft. Maisie pointed to a section in the lower right corner of the panel where the labels were smaller and more crowded together. Then she pointed to a single small hook, mounted to the metal frame of the panel in a way that was so integrated into the overall texture of the panel that it had read, every time Diana had looked at it, as part of the frame itself. And hanging on the hook, on a short loop of aged wire, was a single small key. Diana stood up. She crossed the room. She looked at the key. It was small and flat and old, the kind of key used for secondary security latches in institutional settings, not the kind that was often called a cabinet key or a security key, simple and specific. She took it off the hook. She crossed to the locked door. She put the key into the secondary latch. It turned. The latch clicked back. She pressed down on the lever handle and pushed the door, and it moved, stiffly, reluctantly. But it moved, swinging inward on hinges that announced their resistance with a long, slow sound that filled the concrete corridor and seemed to arrive at Diana's ears not just as sound, but as something else, something more physical, like a pressure change, like a held breath finally released. She stood in the doorway. She lifted her flashlight because the LED strips from the main room didn't reach far enough into whatever lay beyond, and she turned it on, and she pointed it inward, and she looked. The room on the other side was different from the main chamber in every way. Where the main room had been utilitarian and plain, this room was dense and specific. Where the main room had been empty of everything except what Diana had brought, this room was full. Not cluttered. Organized. The kind of organization that suggested careful intention, a system, a purpose. Diana's flashlight moved across metal shelving of the heavy industrial variety, the kind used in serious long-term storage. Across containers she couldn't immediately identify, as across what appeared to be documentation, folders, binders, things protected in sealed plastic of a heavy gauge, stacked in even rows on dedicated shelving. Across the floor, which was not bare concrete like the main room, but had been lined with what appeared to be a moisture protection membrane of some kind, thick black sheeting still fully adhered after 60 years. But none of that was what made Diana's flashlight stop moving. At the far end of the secondary chamber, stacked against the wall in rows she could only partially see in the flashlight beam, were metal cases. Long, heavy cases of the type Diana associated vaguely with military equipment, the kind of case used for instruments or materials that need to be transported without damage and stored without degradation. Each case was sealed with a fastening mechanism, and each case bore markings she couldn't fully read from the doorway, stenciled in white paint, the paint faded but still legible in places. And she counted the visible cases in her flashlight beam and stopped counting at 12 because the rows extended past what she could see. She stood in the doorway for a long time. The flashlight beam was steady in her hand because she had made her hands steady, had learned to make them steady in the way you learn anything necessary, through practice and need. Behind her, Maisie asked, in a voice that was quiet and careful, because Maisie had inherited her mother's ability to read a room. "What is it, Mom?" Diana turned to look at her daughter. Maisie was standing a few feet back, the lantern in her hand, her dark eyes reading her mother's face, the way she always did when she needed to understand the size of a thing. Diana looked at her daughter's peeling sneakers and her too small jacket, and her careful, watchful 7-year-old eyes that had seen too much and adapted to all of it with grace she was too young to need. She looked at her daughter, and she thought about the dollar she had spent, and the hatch in the ground, and the key on the hook that Maisie had found, the key that had been there the whole time, waiting to be seen by someone who was looking carefully enough. "I don't know yet," Diana said. Her voice was level. She had made it level. "But I think we need to find out." She took a breath. She stepped through the door. The secondary chamber was larger than it had appeared from the doorway. It extended perhaps 30 feet back, the full width of the main room, or close to it, and the ceiling was the same height, but felt lower because the shelving units reached nearly to it. Diana moved slowly, her flashlight sweeping methodically, the way she'd learned to do things in the last 3 years, without rushing, without assuming, taking in what was actually there rather than what she expected or feared or hoped. The moisture-protective flooring was intact throughout. The temperature was notably cooler than the main room. Whether this was by design or simply the result of greater depth, she couldn't tell. The air smelled the same as the main room, dry and old and specific, but underneath it there was something else, faint and metallic, that she couldn't identify. She moved toward the metal cases. Up close, the stenciled markings resolved into legibility. She could read dates, storage dates, font she assumed from the formatting, and she could read reference numbers. And on several of the cases, near the handle end, she could read a designation she didn't immediately recognize. 2 letters and a series of numbers, stenciled in the same faded white, preceded by a small government insignia she could barely make out. She photographed everything. She photographed the cases, the shelving, the documentation binders in their sealed plastic, the floor, the ceiling, the dimensions of the room as best she could capture them. She was shaking slightly now, not from fear, she thought, but from the effort of being precise when what her body wanted to do was something very different. She tried to open one of the cases. The fastening mechanism was a standard military-style clasp, the kind that required simultaneous pressure on 2 release points. She found the points by feel and pressed, and the clasp released, and she opened the lid. Inside the case, nested in a form-fitted foam lining that had preserved its shape perfectly across 60 years of isolation, were bars. Metal bars, rectangular, uniform, stacked in the case in a single layer of 8. Each bar was dull, not bright or gleaming the way precious metals appeared in photographs or films, but matte and dense and yellowed in a way that she had never seen before, but that she recognized the way you recognize things you've only ever seen in photographs. The distinctive tarnished matte of gold that has been sitting in an enclosed space for longer than most people have been alive. Diana picked up one of the bars. It was heavier than she expected, significantly heavier, in the way that gold always is, because gold is denser than the human imagination accounts for. When she held it in 2 hands, it was stamped on its face, the stamp worn but present, a weight, a purity mark, a series of identifiers she didn't fully understand. She set the bar back in the case. She looked at the case. She looked at the rows of cases behind it, extending back into the shadows where her flashlight didn't fully reach. She looked at the documentation on the shelving, the binders, the folders, the sealed records that presumably explained what this was and how it came to be here, and who had put it here, and why they had never come back. She thought about $1. She thought about the auction room and the indifferent silence and the auctioneer's patience and her hand in the air. She thought about the motel room and the peeling sneakers and the calculation she had run every Saturday that never quite worked out. She thought about Maisie on her cot looking at the door Diana had passed every day and catalogued as eventually. And she thought about the key on the hook that had been there the whole time. She stood up. She walked back through the door into the main room. She found her daughter. Maisie was sitting cross-legged on the foam mat in the center of the room, the lantern beside her, watching the doorway with that careful, patient expression. Diana sat down in front of her. She looked at her daughter's face. She thought about everything she wanted to say and everything she didn't yet know how to say, and she settled on the version of the truth that was manageable right now, that was the right-sized version for this particular moment. "I need you to be very patient," Diana said. "Something has happened, and I need to understand what it is before I can explain it to you. Can you do that?" Maisie considered this. "Is it good or bad?" she asked. Diana thought about bars of gold in a military case. She thought about rows and rows of cases extending back into darkness. She thought about the moisture-protective flooring and the sealed documentation and the air that smelled of metal and time. She thought about 60 years of waiting and $1 and a key on a hook that a 7-year-old had found. "I think," Diana said carefully, "that it might be something we haven't had in a long time." "What's that?" Maisie asked. Diana looked at her daughter. She reached out and pushed a strand of dark hair back from Maisie's forehead. Outside the hatch, above them, the field sat flat and quiet under the Oklahoma sky. The wind moved to the scrub grass. The rusted iron hatch stood open, letting in thin, pale light from the world above. And below the world, in a concrete room that smelled of time and metal and the dried residue of decades of sealed waiting, a woman who had bought a door in the ground for $1 held her daughter's face in her hands and said the only word that felt honest. "A chance," Diana said. "I think it might be a chance." She didn't sleep that night. She tried. She lay on her cot in the main room with her eyes closed and her body still and her mind entirely elsewhere, running through loops she couldn't slow down. She thought about the cases. She thought about the bars. She thought about the government insignia on the stenciling, barely legible under 60 years of dim storage air. And she thought about the documentation in the sealed plastic binders on the shelving units, which she had photographed, but not yet opened. She had not opened the binders because she had made herself a rule in the secondary chamber. Document first. Disturb nothing until you understand what you are disturbing. She had photographed everything. When she had opened one case and examined 8 bars, and closed the case again and replaced the clasp. She had left the room the way she found it, or nearly so. She had been precise and controlled because she understood, somewhere in the part of her, that had always been good in emergencies. That precision was the thing that would matter here. What she did not yet understand was why. At 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and sat at the small metal desk with her tablet and began searching. She searched with the same methodical quality she brought to the bunker's renovation, the same quality she brought to her Saturday financial calculations. She searched for the insignia first, describing it as accurately as she could from her photographs, a small circular seal of the kind used by mid-century federal agencies, with an eagle motif she could make out in the better-lit images, and a surrounding text she could not fully read. She searched the 2-letter designation from the cases. She searched for government gold storage programs of the Cold War era, which was the era the bunker belonged to, built in 1961, when the world was holding its breath in a different kind of way. And the federal government was quietly, systematically preparing for a future it hoped would never arrive. What emerged from her searching, in pieces that she assembled slowly over 2 hours of reading, was a partial picture. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, during the peak years of civil defense planning, certain federal programs had involved the decentralized storage of currency reserves and precious metals in locations distributed enough to survive a coordinated nuclear attack on central repositories. The logic was simple and terrible. If Fort Knox was destroyed, the country would still need a financial foundation from which to rebuild. The solution was geographic distribution, not widely publicized, not well documented in accessible records, and because secrecy was a feature rather than a failure of the program. Bunkers, depots, sealed chambers in the kinds of locations that people didn't look at twice. Diana sat back from the tablet. The bunker had been built in 1961, Creek County, Oklahoma. Parcel 7 at the county surplus auction, listed with no specific history beyond its construction date and its classification as a civil defense structure. She thought about the county clerk's office and the incomplete transfer inventory and the key on the hook of the communication panel that had been deemed, apparently, not worth noting in any official record. She thought about $1. She did not let herself think about what she might be sitting on top of. Not yet. The number her mind was trying to form was too large to think about responsibly, and too large to do anything with at 3 in the morning on a cot in an underground room with her daughter asleep 6 feet away. She filed it. She closed the browser. She made a list instead, a physical list, on the small notepad she kept at the desk for her financial calculations. The list had 3 columns. The first column was what she knew. The second column was what she needed to find out. The third column was who she needed to call. The third column was the hardest one. It required trusting someone. Trust was a resource Diana had spent 3 years learning to ration. She wrote down 3 names. One was Tamara, her oldest friend, whose judgment she trusted above almost anyone's and who would not panic. One was a name she'd found in her searching, a firm in Tulsa that dealt with estate appraisals and had a specific division for rare and historical metals. And one was the name of a lawyer, a woman named Constance Adair, who worked out of Tulsa and whose website had appeared in her search results in the context of asset recovery and property law, and who had a line in her biography that said, simply, she specialized in cases involving abandoned or unclaimed property, and worked frequently with individuals who had no prior legal experience. Diana had read that line twice and written the name down. She looked at the 3 names. She looked at the second column, which was longer. Then she looked at the first column, which said, I have a key. I have a locked room. I have cases of gold bars in a bunker I purchased legally for $1 at a county surplus auction. This bunker is on my property. I have a receipt. I have the deed transfer documentation. I have photographs of everything. She folded the notepad closed and set it in the desk drawer. She lay back on her cot. She looked at the ceiling, which was rough concrete 5 feet above her head. Now she thought about Maisie asleep on the cot across the room, one arm curved under her pillow, the way she'd slept since she was 4 years old. She listened to her daughter breathe. She thought about the Saturday calculation, the arithmetic she'd been running for 3 years, looking for the margin that didn't exist. Outside the hatch, the Oklahoma night moved over the field without noticing them. She called Tamara the next morning from the surface. She's standing in the dead grass 20 feet from the hatch, with the early light flat and gray around her, and Maisie still asleep below. She called her before she could think herself out of it. Tamara picked up on the second ring with the easy readiness of someone who expected useful calls, not disaster, because Tamara was that kind of person, and Diana had always been grateful for it. "I need to ask you something," Diana said, "and I need you to not react until I'm finished." There was a pause. "No, okay," Tamara said. Diana told her. She kept it factual and flat. She described the auction and the bunker and the renovation and moving in and the locked door and the key and the secondary chamber. She described the cases. She described opening one and what she found inside, the 8 bars in their foam lining, and the photographs she'd taken, and the research she'd done in the night. She told it the way she would have described a plumbing problem she needed help diagnosing, precisely, without embellishment, covering only what she could verify. When she finished, there was a silence from Tamara that lasted long enough that Diana said, "Are you still there?" "I'm here," Tamara said. "I'm trying to do exactly what you asked me to do, and not react. How's that going?" "Not well." Another pause. Then Tamara said, with the careful steadiness of someone who had decided to be useful rather than alarmed, "What do you need?" That was why Diana had called Tamara first. What she needed, and they agreed, was to go slowly. Not cautious. Slow, strategic slow. Not the slowness of fear, but the slowness of someone who has one opportunity to do something correctly and understands the cost of rushing. The gold was not going anywhere. It had been in that room for decades. It would be in that room tomorrow and next week and next month. What Diana needed was information before action, and the right people before information went anywhere it shouldn't go. She called the Tulsa firm that afternoon. She described what she had without giving an address or any identifying information, using the careful framing she'd thought through during Maisie's school hours, while she sat in the main room with her notepad and thought through scenarios. She described a property she'd recently acquired through a public auction that contained legacy storage items she believed to be precious metals, possibly gold. And she wanted to understand the process for independent authentication and appraisal. The man who answered was professional and unsurprised in the way of someone who handled unusual situations regularly. He asked several questions. He told her the standard process involved a certified assessor performing a physical examination, testing for purity and weight confirmation, cross-referencing any identifying marks against historical records, and producing a written appraisal with market value calculations. He told her the firm worked under strict confidentiality agreements. He asked when she was available for an initial consultation. She made the appointment for Friday, in person. No items brought. Just documentation and photographs. She called Constance Adair's office on Wednesday morning. The call was routed to an associate who took her basic information and asked a few careful questions. And then Constance Adair herself got on the line, which was not what Diana had expected. Her voice was direct and unhurried, and she asked exactly the right questions. When was the auction? What were the transfer documents? Was there any prior lien or reservation of mineral or storage rights recorded on the parcel? And had Diana spoken to the county clerk's office since making the discovery? Diana answered each question. When she was done, Constance said, without any of the condescension Diana had braced for, "You were right to call a lawyer before you called anyone else. Come in Thursday. Bring everything you have." Diana brought everything. She brought the auction receipt, the deed transfer, the county surveyor's parcel documentation, her photographs, and her notepad with its 3-column list. And she sat across from Constance Adair in a small office in a building near the University of Tulsa, and she answered every question Constance asked without editorializing, without speculating about value, without saying what she hoped was true. Constance had the focused quality Diana associated with people who had been doing serious work for a long time and had stopped performing seriousness and simply practiced it. She went through the documents in order. She asked about the chain of title on the parcel going back to original government construction. She asked whether Diana had any record of the parcel's prior disposition before it entered the county surplus inventory. She asked whether the communication she'd received from the county clerk's office regarding the incomplete transfer inventory had been in writing. Most of it had not been in writing. Diana said so. Constance nodded slowly. She wrote something in her own notepad. "That's going to be the interesting question," she said. "What transfers with a property and what doesn't? In general, fixtures and built-in systems transfer with the real property unless specifically excluded. Contents are murkier. The argument on your side is that there was no schedule of exclusions in the auction documentation, which means the contents of the structure, as is at time of sale, arguably transferred with the property." She paused. "The argument on the other side depends on whether the original government placement of materials constitutes a retained interest that survives the property transfer. That argument is weaker than it sounds because the government transferred the parcel to county jurisdiction, and the county sold it with a general conveyance, and no specific reservation of rights was recorded." Diana said, "What does that mean?" Constance looked at her directly. "It means your position is strong?" "It's not certain. Nothing is certain until a court says so. But your position is defensible and in several respects, quite strong. It means you should not touch anything in that room. You should not move anything. You should not discuss this with anyone you haven't already spoken to, and you should let me do some research before your appraisal meeting Friday." She paused. "It also means you need to understand something. If the quantities are what your photographs suggest, this is not going to stay private indefinitely. There will be a point at which government agencies become involved, regardless of your legal position. That doesn't mean your claim is compromised. It means you need to be prepared for a process, not an event." Diana thought about the word process. She thought about the Saturday calculations, and the margin that never worked out, and the motel room, and the gas station, and the 3 years she'd spent waiting for the arithmetic to change. "Oi, how long a process?" she asked. Constance set down her pen. "Cases involving unclaimed government assets and disputed property rights can take anywhere from several months to several years," she said. "I'm not going to tell you something that isn't true. What I can tell you is that the documentation you have is solid. Your legal standing at auction was unambiguous, and you have done everything right so far by moving carefully and seeking counsel before acting. No, those things matter." She gathered Diana's documents and began organizing them into a folder. "Go to your appraisal meeting Friday. Bring only photographs and documentation. Let them tell you what you have, then come back to me." Diana went home to her bunker. She descended the steps and closed the hatch and sat at the small metal desk while Maisie ate a bowl of cereal at the other desk and did homework with the focused quiet that had been one of her daughter's consistent gifts since she learned to read. Diana did not tell Maisie what she'd learned. She wasn't ready to. The information was still too large and too fragile, like a structure she was building beam by beam that hadn't yet reached the point where it could bear weight. That night, after Maisie was asleep, Diana went back to the secondary chamber with her flashlight and her notepad. She moved slowly through the room, counting the cases she could now see clearly. She had brought a second LED light and positioned it to illuminate the full depth of the shelving. She counted with the kind of deliberate patience that precluded error. She counted the cases stacked against the back wall, the cases on the shelving units on both sides, the cases stacked flat on the floor in the protected area near the sealed documentation. She counted twice and got the same number both times. She wrote the number down. She did not write down what that number might mean in dollars, because she was not going to let herself do that arithmetic until she had independent confirmation. She was not going to build a life on a number she'd calculated herself in a concrete room in the dark. She had done too much of that already, calculated her way toward hope, and found the hope unreliable. She would wait for the appraisal. She waited 3 days. The appraisal firm's office in Tulsa was on the second floor of a building near the historic district, the kind of office that conveyed solidity without ostentation. Dark wood, orderly shelves, the particular quiet of a space where serious assessments happened regularly. The assessor who met with her was named Harold Vance, and a compact man in his late 50s, with the careful hands and patient eyes of someone who had spent his career looking at things other people had overlooked. He went through her photographs methodically, using a magnifying glass for the close-up images of the stenciled markings. He asked her to walk him through each image in sequence. He took his own notes. He did not express surprise or excitement or any emotion Diana could easily read, which she found reassuring rather than alarming, and because it suggested he was evaluating rather than performing. At the end of the photographs, he set his magnifying glass down and laced his fingers together on the desk and looked at her. "I need to ask you a few clarifying questions," he said. "The stenciled markings on the cases. Can you walk me through the 2-letter designation and the numbers that followed it again?" She had written them down from her photographs. She read them to him. He nodded slowly. He said, "And the insignia, the circular seal with the eagle motif. Was the surrounding text legible at all in any of the images?" She had enhanced 2 of the photographs on her tablet. She showed him. He studied them. He nodded again. Then he asked her to wait, and he left the room, and she sat alone in the appraisal office for 11 minutes. She tracked it on her phone without meaning to, the way you track time when you're sitting very still and your body is doing the work of remaining composed. She looked at her own hands. She looked at the orderly shelves. She looked at a framed certificate on the wall from a professional association of metals assessors and read it twice without retaining it. She thought about Harold Vance in the other room, looking something up, cross-referencing the markings against whatever database or historical archive he had access to, and she thought about what Constance Adair had said about her position being strong, and she thought about a key on a hook that a 7-year-old had found. Harold Vance came back into the room. He sat down. He looked at her with the same careful, neutral expression, and then he placed a printed sheet on the desk between them. A page of reference material she could see was from a federal government archive database. Text, dense and dry and official. He placed his finger at a specific entry on the page. "The designation on your cases corresponds to a Civil Defense Emergency Reserve Program," he said. "It was a sub-program of the larger Treasury Contingency Planning of 1958 to 1963. I've seen documentation of this program in reference materials, but I have never, in 31 years of practice, encountered the physical contents." He paused. He was choosing his words with a care she could feel. The program involved the storage of gold bullion in distributed locations as a reserve against infrastructure collapse. The storage sites were selected for geological stability, remote access, and defensibility. The materials were logged in an internal program inventory, and then the inventory was classified and the field records sealed. He paused again. The classification lapsed in 1989, which is how the program exists in historical reference materials at all. But the field locations, the actual site records, were never systematically declassified and transferred to public archives. They exist somewhere in federal records, presumably. But for all practical purposes, the sites themselves were simply forgotten. Diana sat with this for a moment. Forgotten, she said. The program was winding down by 1965, Harold said. Budget consolidation, shifting strategic priorities, the development of more sophisticated reserve mechanisms. What happened to the sites varied. Some were decommissioned and cleared. Some were transferred to local jurisdictions in general property conveyances. Some may have simply been left. He looked at her. The parcel you purchased, it was transferred from federal to county jurisdiction when? Diana checked her notes. 1978, she said. The county records show a general property conveyance from a federal civil defense account to the Creek County land inventory. Harold nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Without physically examining the materials, I cannot produce a formal appraisal. That requires direct access, weight confirmation, purity testing with appropriate equipment. But based on your photographs and the case identifiers, I can give you an estimate of scale." Diana said, "Please." He picked up his pen. He wrote a number on a notepad and turned it to face her. She looked at it. The number on the notepad had 9 digits. It had a $sign in front of it and a range notation after it, a low estimate and a high estimate, separated by a dash, and both of the estimates had 9 digits, and the first of those digits was a 2, and the second was an 8. She looked at the number for a long time without speaking. The room was very quiet. The orderly shelves stood at their attention. The framed certificate hung on the wall. Outside, Tulsa went about its afternoon business with no knowledge of the number on the notepad on the desk in the appraisal office on the second floor, where a woman who had paid $1 for a door in the ground was sitting very still and looking at a figure that represented a complete restructuring of every assumption she had made about the rest of her life. "That's based on current gold spot pricing," Harold said, "with adjustments for the historical and provenance premium that materials of this kind typically command from institutional buyers. The range accounts for variations in the condition of individual bars and for the uncertainty in total count from photographs alone." He paused. "It's a preliminary estimate. It could be revised in either direction once a physical examination is completed." He looked at her carefully. "Are you all right?" Diana thought about the motel room. She thought about the gas station shift that started at 5:45 in the morning and the restaurant shift that ended at 11:30 at night, and the calculation she ran every Saturday that never worked out. She thought about Maisie's peeling sneakers and her okay, and her books on the salvaged lumber shelf, and the key she'd found because she had been looking carefully. "Yes," she said. Her voice was level. She had made it level. "Can you tell me, the formal appraisal process, how would that work, given the questions about ownership?" Harold nodded, as though he had been waiting for exactly this question. "Typically, in cases involving assets, whose legal status is in dispute or under examination, an appraisal is conducted jointly, the independent assessor and representatives from any party with a potential claim. In this instance, that would likely involve, at minimum, on your legal representation and a representative from the relevant federal entity once the site becomes known to them." He paused. "Which it will." "My lawyer mentioned that," Diana said. "She's right," Harold said. "The question is not whether this becomes a matter of government awareness. The question is on whose terms and in what sequence. The terms and sequence matter considerably for how your claim is evaluated." He set his pen down. "My strong recommendation is that you contact your legal counsel immediately after this meeting and discuss the timing and method of voluntary disclosure. Proactive disclosure, before the site is discovered by other means, is significantly better for your position than discovery. Diana looked at the number on the notepad one more time. Then she looked up at Harold Vance. "Can I keep that?" she asked, nodding at the notepad page. He tore it off and slid it across the desk to her. "Preliminary estimate only," he said. "Not a formal appraisal." "I understand," Diana said. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. She thanked him and scheduled the formal appraisal for the following week, contingent on her legal counsel's guidance. She drove back to Creek County with the number folded against her chest, the interstate flat and direct through the Oklahoma afternoon, the light long and pale across the scrub plains on either side. She drove carefully and within the speed limit, and she did not cry, which surprised her because she had cried at considerably smaller things over the last 3 years. She thought maybe the number was too large for crying, that there was a scale of event beyond which the body didn't know how to respond with something as ordinary as tears. She parked on the access track. She sat in her car for a few minutes looking at the field. The iron hatch was visible from where she sat, on just the edge of it, the rusted outline against the dirt. $1. Parcel 7. Creek County surplus. The hatch that nobody else had wanted. She called Constance Adair from the car and described the meeting and the preliminary estimate. Constance was quiet for a moment at the other end. Then she said, with the same direct, unhurried calm she had maintained throughout, "All right. I need to make some calls. Don't discuss this with anyone new. But I'll call you tonight." Diana went down into the bunker. Maisie was back from school, sitting on her cot with a library book, and she looked up when Diana came down the steps with the expression she'd worn for months now. Watchful, reading the room, calibrating. Diana sat down on her own cot across from her daughter. She looked at Maisie's face, the dark eyes, and the serious mouth, and the strand of hair that had to be pushed back from her forehead approximately 11 times per day. "Mom," Maisie said, "something happened today." "Something happened today for me, too," Diana said. "You first." Maisie held up her library book. It was a reference book about the Cold War, from the school library, clearly not her usual reading. "I was looking things up," Maisie said, "about the bunker, about what it was for." She paused with the gravity she brought to important statements. "Did you know that the government built a lot of secret rooms during that time? Like, specifically to put things in them that they didn't want people to find?" Diana looked at her daughter. She felt the number in her jacket pocket like a warmth. "I did know that," she said. "Recently." Maisie nodded, as though confirming a theory. "I think the room might be one of those," she said carefully. "The locked room." Diana looked at her daughter for a long time. She thought about the key Maisie had found. She thought about the Cold War reference book from the school library. She thought about the 7-year-old who said okay to a bunker and asked about her books and adapted to things children shouldn't have to adapt to, with a grace that was both her gift and her mother's private grief. She thought about what it meant that Maisie had been doing her own research, quietly, in parallel, the way she'd learned to do things, watching, thinking, finding the key that was there the whole time. And she reached into her jacket pocket, and she took out the folded piece of notepad paper, and she held it for a moment. Then she put it back. Not yet. The number was still too large and too new. There was still too much uncertain. The legal process Constance was working through, the formal appraisal scheduled for next week, the government involvement that was coming on a timeline she couldn't fully control. She would tell Maisie the whole truth when the whole truth was stable enough to hand to a 7-year-old. "I think you might be right," she said. "And I've been talking to some people who know about these things. We're going to figure it out carefully." Maisie considered this. She held her Cold War library book. "Are we going to have to give it back?" she asked. "If there's something in there, are we going to have to give it to the government?" Diana thought about Constance Adair and her measured words about legal positions and proactive disclosure, and cases involving abandoned or unclaimed property. She thought about what it meant to have a strong position and a solid receipt and a deed transfer document and a lawyer who specialized in exactly this kind of thing. She thought about 60 years of waiting in a sealed room while a program was forgotten, its field records classified and then lapsed and then simply unretrieved, the sites transferring through jurisdictions without anyone ever opening the right door. "I don't know yet," she said, "but our lawyer thinks we have a good argument that it belongs to us. Because we bought it. Because we have the paperwork." She looked at Maisie. "And because nobody came back for it." Maisie thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "That's kind of sad," she said finally. "Some that nobody came back." Diana had not thought of it that way. She thought about it now. Whatever transaction had originally placed those cases in that sealed room, whatever person or office or program had locked that secondary chamber and left the key on the communication panel hook, the government that had built and then forgotten, the long American silence of 60 years over a door in the ground. It was kind of sad, in the way that abandoned things were always kind of sad, regardless of their value. In the way that waiting without anyone knowing you were waiting was a particular kind of loneliness, even when the thing waiting was inert and unfeeling and made of dense yellow metal in sealed military cases. "It is," Diana said. "It really is." Constance called that night at 9 after Maisie was asleep. Diana went up to the surface, standing in the dark field with the stars open overhead and the wind across the scrub grass, and she listened. Aunt Constance had done her research. She had found the program designation in the Federal Records database. Harold Vance's identification had been correct. She had traced the parcel's chain of title through the 1978 conveyance and the subsequent county land inventory, and the 2019 reclassification to surplus and the 2023 auction. She had found no recorded reservation of rights, no specific exclusion of contents, no recovery notice filed by any federal agency in relation to the parcel. Nothing, and the parcel had moved from federal civil defense custody to county jurisdiction and sat in surplus inventory for 45 years and been sold at public auction for $1. And at no point in that entire chain had anyone noted the contents of the secondary chamber in any recorded document. "Here's what I want to do," Constance said. "I want to file a property claim with the county, by formally registering the discovery of significant assets on the parcel and establishing your claim of ownership under the deed transfer. I want to do this before we make any contact with the federal side, because the sequence matters. When the federal inquiry comes, and it will come, I want there to be an existing recorded claim that predates their interest. That changes the framing from discovery to defense." Diana said. "How soon?" "I'm filing Monday," Constance said. "The formal appraisal the following week, with the joint team will request. I've handled 3 cases involving abandoned government assets in 22 years of practice. Yours is the largest by a significant margin, but the legal structure is similar." She paused. "I want you to know something. I reviewed your auction documentation again tonight. The county sold that parcel under a general conveyance with no reservation of rights and no schedule of excluded contents. The legal principle of fixtures and appurtenances, the rule that what's attached to or contained within a property at time of sale transfers with it, is well established. Your position is strong. I mean that." Diana looked up at the stars over the Oklahoma field. She thought about the auction room and the silence and the auctioneer's patience. She thought about the hatch in the ground and the key on the hook and her daughter asleep below her in the light of LED strips that burned with the warm, leaning glow Diana had chosen specifically for this. "What do I do between now and Monday?" she said. "You do what you've been doing," Constance said. "You go to work. You take your daughter to the bus stop. You document everything and move nothing. And you hold on to the fact that you have done every single thing correctly so far." A pause. Most people don't. Most people who stumble into something like this act on it immediately. They move things. They tell people. They make decisions before they have the information they need. You haven't done any of that. "I've been poor for 3 years, Diana said. "I learned to wait for information before I spend money I don't have." Constance Adair, the lawyer who specialized in abandoned property and worked with people who had no prior legal experience, was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's exactly the right way to think about it." Diana said goodnight and hung up. She stood in the dark field for a moment longer. The wind was cool and direct across the flat land, carrying the faint smell of the creek bed a quarter-mile east. The hatch behind her was closed and locked, the iron set flush with the Oklahoma ground. She could hear nothing below. No sound carried up through the earth and the concrete. No evidence of anything that lay beneath. From the surface, you would see a woman standing alone in a field. You would see nothing else. You would drive past on the county road, and you would see flat land and scrub grass and an access track and a parked car. And you would see no evidence at all that beneath one particular patch of that field was a concrete room where a woman's daughter was asleep with a Cold War library book, and below that, another room where 60 years of sealed metal waited in cases that had been stenciled with numbers and never counted and never claimed. $1, Diana thought. She thought it the way you say a thing to yourself that you haven't yet finished understanding, repetitively, the way the mind turns a stone over and over to look at each face. $1. Parcel 7. Nobody came back. She went back down below. The formal appraisal happened on a Thursday, 10 days after her meeting with Harold Vance. It took most of the day. Harold Vance came himself, with an associate named Torres, who handled the testing equipment, a portable XRF analyzer that could determine elemental composition non-destructively, pressing its sensor face against the surface of each bar in sequence. Constance Adair was present for the full examination, as was an attorney from a federal agency Diana did not immediately recognize, a quiet man in his 40s named Ellison, who said very little and took very careful notes. He had been informed of the formal property claim Constance had filed on Monday. His presence, Constance had told Diana beforehand, was exactly what she had expected. Official acknowledgement of the situation, early positioning. His presence was not hostile. It was procedural. They worked through the secondary chamber systematically, opening each case in sequence, counting, weighing, testing. Diana stood near the doorway and watched, and kept her face composed and her hands still. Maisie was at school. Diana had not told her this would happen today, because she hadn't been ready to explain the full scope of what was happening, and because she'd wanted to see the official count first, to have the number confirmed before she handed it to her daughter as something real. She watched Harold Vance and his associate move through the cases with the care of people who understood what they were handling. She watched Constance watch Ellison, and Ellison watch the count. She stood in a concrete room that smelled of time and metal 60 feet underground in the Oklahoma plains, and she waited for the arithmetic to change. At the end of the afternoon, Harold Vance stood up and looked at his clipboard, and then at Diana. His expression had maintained its professional neutrality throughout the day, as she had expected. But there was something in the way he looked at her now. Not excitement, not drama, but a quality of care, done as though he understood that what he was about to say had weight beyond its technical content, and he wanted to carry it accordingly. "I'll need several days to produce the formal written appraisal," he said. "But I can tell you the confirmed count, and I can tell you the current market value range based on the purity readings." He paused, He looked at his clipboard again, not because he had forgotten the number, but because he was a careful man, and careful men verified before speaking. And then he looked at her. 287 cases. Each case contains 8 bars of 99.5 to 99.9 purity gold. Individual bar weight averages 27 pounds. Current spot price adjusted for provenance premium and the historical significance of the program of origin. He paused. Total estimated value between $281 million and $294 million. The secondary chamber was very quiet. The XRF analyzer sat on the floor where Torres had set it down. The cases were closed and replaced on their shelving, returned to the arrangement they'd occupied for 60 years. The moisture-protective sheeting lay undisturbed on the floor. The sealed documentation sat on its shelves in its heavy plastic, examined and photographed, but not opened. That was for a separate process, Constance had said, a records review that the federal side would conduct in parallel. Diana said, on 287 cases. Harold nodded. She had counted 288 on her second count. The discrepancy of one case did not matter. Nothing in the range of one case mattered now. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She had become very good at steady. Ellison, the federal attorney, spoke for only the second time in the entire day. He said, quietly and without hostility, "Ms. Calloway, my agency will be in contact with your counsel regarding the process going forward. I want to tell you, as a personal observation and not a formal statement, that you've handled this with an unusual amount of care. That matters for how these things go." Diana looked at him. She thought about careful and about precision, and about the 3-column list she'd made at 3 a.m, and about Constance Adair on the phone in the dark field, and about $1, and about everything she'd done correctly, while not knowing it was possible that correct could matter this much. "I've had some practice," she said, "at being careful with things I can't afford to lose." She climbed the steps and pushed the hatch open and stood in the late afternoon light. The field was the same field it had always been, flat and dry and unremarkable, the kind of field you drove past without seeing it. The sun was low and orange over the western horizon. The wind had died to almost nothing. In 40 minutes, Maisie's school bus would reach the stop 3/4 of a mile down the access track, and Maisie would step off with her backpack and her library books, and she would walk toward her mother in the late light. And Diana would be standing here, in this field, with a number in her head that was large enough to change the rest of everything. She stood in the light, and she waited for her daughter to come home. She saw Maisie before Maisie saw her. That was usually how it went. Diana positioned herself at the edge of the access track far enough back that Maisie had to walk a bit before she noticed her mother standing there. And Diana used that interval, that 30 or 40 seconds of Maisie walking with her backpack and her library book with her head down and her sneakers on the county road, to look at her daughter the way you can only look at someone when they don't know you're watching, without the responsibility of being seen, without having to arrange her face into something that would not worry her child. She looked at Maisie walking toward her, and she thought about the number in her head. 287 cases. Each case, 8 bars. Each bar 27 pounds of gold at 99.5 purity minimum. A total somewhere between $281 million and $294 million, sitting in a concrete room 60 feet below the field she was standing in, waiting. Maisie looked up and saw her, and her face changed. A quick, reflexive brightening that she then regulated back into her normal, careful expression. Because Maisie had learned to moderate her responses to her mother's presence, had learned not to signal too much relief at Diana being exactly where she'd said she'd be, because she had also experienced the times when Diana wasn't. That regulation was one of the things Diana most wanted to undo. The practiced steadiness in a 7-year-old's face when her mother came to meet her at the bus stop was a damage Diana intended to repair, however long it took. Maisie reached her, and Diana hugged her, which she always did. The full-held hug that she gave every single day, regardless of circumstance. Because she had read once that children need 8 hugs a day for emotional maintenance, and 20 for growth, and she was not going to be the reason her daughter ran a deficit. Maisie hugged back with the automatic ease of a child, for whom this particular contact had been consistent enough to become structural. "How was school?" Diana asked. "Good." Maisie fell into step beside her on the access track, heading toward the hatch. "We had a substitute in history, and he didn't know what he was talking about, so I corrected him twice." Diana looked at her. "Were you polite?" Maisie considered. "I was accurate." Diana looked at the field. She looked at the hatch approaching as they walked. She thought about Constance Adair and Harold Vance, and the quiet federal attorney Ellison, and the XRF analyzer, and the number on the notepad that had been in her jacket pocket for 10 days. Folded small, the paper beginning to soften at the creases. She thought about timing and readiness, and the right-sized version of the truth for any given moment. They reached the hatch. Diana unlocked it, and swung it open, and held it for Maisie, who went down first now, her hand on the pipe railing, and comfortable enough with the descent that she no longer watched her feet. Diana followed and pulled the hatch shut, and heard the lock engage, and descended the last steps into the warm-leaning LED light of the main room. She said, "Maisie, can you sit down for a minute? I want to tell you something." Maisie sat on her cot and put her backpack down, and looked at her mother with complete attention. Diana sat on the cot across from her. She looked at her daughter's face. She thought about what Constance had said, every single thing correctly so far. And she thought about what Harold had said about care, and what Ellison had said about how you handle things and how it matters. She thought about how she would tell this story, the story of $1 in a hatch and a key on a hook, and she thought about who she was telling it to, a 7-year-old who had found the key, who had been doing her own research with a Cold War library book, who had asked if they were going to have to give it back, and then said it was kind of sad that nobody came back. She took the folded notepad paper out of her jacket pocket, and she held it in her hands. "I need to tell you what's happening," she said. "The full version. You've been patient, and you've been asking the right questions, and you found the key, so you deserve to know." Maisie nodded. Diana told her. She started at the beginning. The auction, the dollar, the deed, the decision to come here when they had nowhere else to go. She told her about the secondary chamber and what she'd found and the research she'd done at 3 in the morning. She told her about Tamara and Constance and Harold Vance and what the government program had been, what the bunker had originally been for, why those cases had been placed in that room in 1961, and why no one had ever come back to retrieve them. She told her about the filing Constance had made, and the formal appraisal, and Ellison writing his notes at the edge of the room. She told her everything in the flat and honest way she'd always talked to her daughter about hard things, because Maisie had never responded well to softened versions, and Diana had learned early that the full truth given carefully was easier for Maisie to work with than a partial truth she'd spend energy trying to fill in. Then she unfolded the notepad paper and held it out. Maisie took it. She looked at the number Harold Vance had written, the 9-digit figure with its range, the $sign at the front. She looked at it for a long time. Her expression went through several phases that Diana watched carefully. Surprise, which she had prepared for, and then a longer, more internal processing, which she had also expected, and then something she hadn't expected, a look that was quieter and more specific than either of those, a look that was almost mournful. "That's been there the whole time?" Maisie said. "In the other room." "Since 1961, Diana said. Maisie looked at the number again. While we were in the motel, Diana felt this land in her chest the way precise things always did. Yes, she said. Maisie was quiet for a moment. She folded the notepad paper back along its crease lines, carefully, so the way Diana had folded it, and she held it in both hands. But we didn't know, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a reconciliation. The first move toward making something that had happened make sense. The same motion Diana had been making internally for 10 days. We didn't know. There was no version of the past where this could have gone differently, because they hadn't known, and you can't act on what you don't know. You can only act on what you find. We didn't know, Diana confirmed. Maisie handed the paper back. Diana folded it and put it in her pocket. They sat for a moment in the warm, leaning light of the bunker room, with the corkboard of Maisie's drawings on the wall, the horse pictures and the rainbow pictures, and the picture of the three of them that included Marcus, drawn from memory, and the salvaged lumber shelf with their books, and the chemical toilet behind its curtain, and the pipe railing at child height on the stairwell. The room that had been enough, because enough was what they had. What happens now? Maisie asked. Our lawyer is working on the legal part, Diana said. There will be a process. It might take a while. But she thinks our claim is strong, because we bought this property legally, and there was no reservation of the contents in the sale, and nobody has come to claim it in 60 years. Maisie thought about this. And if we win, she said carefully, as though feeling out the shape of a contingency she was not yet allowing herself to believe in. What do we do? Diana looked at her daughter. She thought about the question, and she thought about every answer she'd been forming and discarding over the past 10 days. Every plant that felt too large to think. Every version of a future she'd refused to construct until the legal structure was stable enough to build on. She had been so careful for so long about not building on unconfirmed ground. When she had learned that from the 3 years of building careful hopes on margins that never materialized, she had learned to wait for the arithmetic to be confirmed before she let herself believe the answer. But her daughter was looking at her and asking what happens next, and Maisie had found the key, and the arithmetic had been confirmed by a certified assessor with 31 years of practice in the presence of a federal attorney who had said, now with personal observation rather than formal statement, that Diana had handled it with an unusual amount of care. I don't know exactly, Diana said honestly, but I know we find you new sneakers, and then we find you a room with a window. Maisie looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in her daughter's face, something that had been held in careful reserve for a very long time released, not all at once but incrementally, the way light changes at the end of a long afternoon. Not dramatics, not crying, just a slow, private brightening in the careful dark eyes, the face of a child who had been waiting, without letting herself fully know she was waiting, for permission to stop preparing for the worst. With a window, Maisie repeated. With a window, Diana said. The legal process took 8 months. Diana had prepared herself for longer, and had been prepared, if necessary, to wait indefinitely, the way she had learned to wait for things she couldn't control. But 8 months, Constance told her afterward, was fast for a case of this complexity, and the reason it moved at the speed it did was the sequence. The property claim, filed before the federal inquiry arrived, the existing recorded interest that established Diana's position as owner with a pre-existing claim rather than as discoverer with a competing interest. The sequence had been Constance's strategy, and it had worked exactly as Constance had predicted it would, which was the kind of professional competence that Diana felt, in some uncomplicated way, was the most beautiful thing she had witnessed in years. The federal side had sent a team in week 3, a formal assessment group that conducted their own documentation of the secondary chamber, working from the inventory, established at the joint appraisal. Ellison was part of that team. He was as quiet and careful as he had been the day of the appraisal, and he treated Diana, in their interactions, not with a straightforward professional respect that she had not taken for granted. There had been an agency claim filed. Constance had expected this, had described it to Diana as a procedural formality, a necessary step in the government's process that did not in itself indicate the strength of their position. What mattered was the law and the documentation. The law said that property transferred through a valid public conveyance, with no reservation of rights transferred with its contents. The documentation showed an unbroken chain of title from federal to county to Diana, with no specific exclusion ever recorded. The 60-year absence of any federal recovery effort was not invisible. It was part of the record, cited by Constance in her filings, evidence of abandonment in the legal sense of a claim not pursued. The negotiated settlement, which Constance had predicted would be the resolution rather than a court ruling, took 3 months to finalize after the preliminary agreement in principle. The government retained the historical records and documentation, the sealed binders in their heavy plastic, which had turned out to contain program correspondence, logistics records, and a chain of custody that ended, simply, in 1965, when the program was administratively closed without a decommission order ever being issued for this particular site. The gold and its value was Diana's. When she sat in Constance Adair's office the day the settlement was signed, and she held the document, and she looked at the number on it, which was $285 million, a figure that split the difference between the low and high appraisal estimates and accounted for the government's recovery of the historical documentation as part of its interest. And she felt something she was not certain she had ever felt before. Something that was not happiness exactly, or at least not only happiness, but something she eventually identified as the particular sensation of the arithmetic finally working out. She had run the calculation correctly. She had waited for the right information. She had moved carefully and sought counsel and documented everything and refused to act on unconfirmed numbers. And the number was confirmed. The arithmetic worked. The margin was real. She thanked Constance, who said, and with the direct warmth Diana had come to recognize as her natural register, that it had been the most interesting case of her professional life, and that she meant that as a compliment to Diana's handling of it, not to the money. Diana believed her. She called Tamara from the parking lot. Tamara, who had known for 8 months and had told no one, and had called Diana every Sunday evening to check in with a discipline and reliability that had been its own kind of gift, answered on the first ring. And Diana said, "It's done." Tamara was quiet for a moment, and then she said, simply, "Okay." And then she started crying, which she had been declining to do for 8 months, and Diana listened to her oldest friend cry with relief, and did not cry herself, because she had not cried yet, and she was waiting to understand where and when that would happen. She picked Maisie up from school that afternoon herself, not at the bus stop, but at the school building. I'm standing outside the front entrance at 2:45 with the settlement document in her bag and new sneakers on her daughter's feet, which had happened in month 2 because that she had refused to wait on. Maisie came out with her backpack and her library books and saw her mother and stopped. She read her mother's face with the speed and accuracy she had always possessed. She read it, and she understood what she read. "Is it done?" she asked. "It's done," Diana said. Maisie stood on the school steps for a moment. Then she walked down the steps and took her mother's hand, the way she had on the day they stood in the dead Oklahoma field, looking at the iron hatch. Palm to palm, fingers closing in the particular grip Diana would have recognized in complete darkness. They walked to the car. Diana opened the door, and Maisie got in, and Diana went around and sat in the driver's seat and didn't start the car for a moment. She sat with her hands on the steering wheel, and she looked at the school parking lot and the ordinary afternoon going past outside the windows, and she thought about the hatch in the ground, and the dollar, and the key, and the 8 months, and the number. "Where do you want to go?" she asked her daughter. Maisie thought about this with her characteristic gravity, in the way of someone who takes questions seriously and gives them the consideration they deserve. "Can we get ice cream first?" she said. "And then can we go see the apartment?" Because Diana had found the apartment, she had found it in month 4, before the settlement was finalized, working from the expectation that Constance had given her, a confident, measured expectation, not a guarantee, but the kind of assessment from a professional she trusted that allowed her to begin doing the preliminary work of believing in a future. The apartment was in Tulsa, and in a neighborhood with a good elementary school and a library branch 3 blocks away, and a park with a climbing structure that Maisie had already visited twice during the research process, under the pretense of passing through. It had 2 bedrooms. Both bedrooms had windows. "Ice cream first," Diana confirmed. "Then the apartment." Maisie nodded. She looked out the passenger window at the parking lot. After a moment, she said, without looking at her mother, and the way she sometimes said the important things, sideways, when she thought the direct approach might put too much weight on whatever she was trying to say. "Mom, I'm really glad you went to that auction." Diana started the car. She looked at the road ahead, which was ordinary and clear and entirely manageable. "Me too," she said. "Me too, sweetheart." She had not cried yet. She drove to the ice cream place, and she watched Maisie eat a cone with the focused pleasure of a child who had not had an ice cream cone in some time and was not pretending to be casual about it. And she sat across from her daughter in the small shop with the afternoon light coming in through the window, and she felt the thing she had been carrying for 3 years shift. Not release completely. That would take time. It would take the accumulated evidence of mornings that were not emergency mornings, and months that were not survival months, and the slow replacement of braced expectation with something more ordinary. It would take Maisie coming home from school to a room with a window. It would take the Saturday calculation working out, and then working out again, and then working out enough times that she stopped running it as an emergency exercise and started running it as a planning tool. It would take time. But sitting in the ice cream shop with her daughter's face bright in the afternoon window light, Diana felt the shift, the weight redistribution of a structure that had been built entirely on tension beginning, carefully to relax. She cried in the parking lot afterward, with Maisie inside finishing her cone, and Diana standing next to the car with her hand on the door. She cried the way she'd cried in the motel bathroom with the water running, privately, with her face turned away from windows, with her body doing the work of feeling a thing she had postponed for too long. But this time, what it broke open was not the grief of her daughter's premature capability. This time, what broke open was simpler and almost embarrassingly ordinary. Relief. Pure, structural, foundational relief. The arithmetic worked. The number was confirmed. They had a place with a window. She dried her face. She got back in the car. Maisie came out of the shop and got in the passenger seat and looked at her mother's face and read it accurately, the way she always did, and said nothing about what she read, the way she had learned to do. She just put on her seatbelt. And Diana started the car and they drove toward the apartment, and the afternoon held them in its ordinary light. And it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything. There are moments in a life where the direction changes, not the small redirections, the job you take or leave, the city you move to, the relationship that runs its course, but the ones that reorder the whole structure, that divide a life into before and after so decisively that the before begins to feel like something that happened to a different person in a different geography entirely. Diana Calloway had one of those moments on a morning in Creek County, Oklahoma, on standing in a dead field with a receipt for $1 and a hatch in the ground she had purchased at a county surplus auction because she had no other options, and an iron hatch in the ground was the only thing in the world being offered to her at a price she could pay. What she found below that hatch was extraordinary in every sense of the word. But it is worth saying what was also true, that she nearly didn't go to the auction, and she nearly decided the filing fee was a resource she couldn't justify. She nearly let herself believe that unusual things didn't happen to people in situations like hers, that the domain of the unexpected was reserved for people with more margin, more options, more runway from which to take off toward whatever improbable destination. She had almost not gone. She went because she was out of alternatives. And being out of alternatives, she had walked into that auction room with $1 in her pocket and her hand in the air, and she had bought a hatch and a set of keys and a deed to 60 feet of Oklahoma earth and the concrete room below it and the secondary chamber at the end of the corridor and the key on the hook of the communication panel and the cases on the shelving and the 60-year-old sealed weight of a program that had been forgotten by everyone except the ground. She moved into the Tulsa apartment in the 9th month. She and Maisie carried boxes up from the car in the morning light, the boxes that contained everything they owned, which was not much, but was theirs. Maisie's bedroom was the smaller of the two by the front of the building, with a window that looked out on the tree-lined street and the park a block away. And when Maisie walked into that room for the first time and stood in it and looked at the window, she didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked. She looked at the window and the light coming through it, and the street below with its trees beginning their spring leaves. And then she turned around to her mother in the doorway, and she said, with all the gravity and precision and 7-year-old composure of someone reporting a finding, "It's a good window." Diana looked at her daughter in the room with the window. She thought about okay. She thought about the motel bathroom and the water running, and the grief for the childhood Maisie deserved and wasn't getting, and the grief for her daughter's premature capability, the adaptability that should not have been necessary, the steadiness that should not have been required. She thought about all of it, and she looked at Maisie's face, and she saw something she had been watching for. The first, fragile, early evidence of a child relaxing. Not yet. Not fully. That would take time, on the accumulated time of not being in an emergency. But the beginning of it, the first indicator, the way the first green shows in a field after a long season. "It is," Diana said. "It's a very good window." She enrolled Maisie in the new school, the one 3 blocks from the library, and she signed her up for the after-school reading program because Maisie would have consumed it whole if Diana hadn't placed it in front of her, and she bought school supplies that were new rather than second-hand, which was a small thing, but not to Maisie, who ran her hand over the smooth cover of a new notebook with a reverence Diana recognized as the particular appreciation of a child who has not had new things for long enough that new things have weight. She bought her daughter 8 pairs of sneakers because she intended to run a surplus on the sneaker accounting, and she bought them in different colors and different styles so that Maisie could have preferences. If I could have the ordinary luxury of choosing the blue ones today and the red ones tomorrow without the choice meaning anything larger than aesthetic preference. She established a fund for Maisie's education with a portion of the settlement proceeds. Not a trust, not yet. That came later, with a financial advisor Constance recommended, a woman named Petra, who specialized in sudden wealth transitions and who spent their first meeting not discussing money, but discussing something she called emotional timeline, the gap between a financial change and the psychological experience of believing the change is real and permanent. Diana had found this unexpectedly useful. She had spent 3 years running every decision through a filter of scarcity, and the filter was not simply removed by the settlement, It remained, triggering its small warnings at price tags and grocery store totals and electricity bills that were not yet crises. Petra told her this was normal and would diminish with time and evidence, and Diana believed her in the intellectual way she believed things before she fully inhabited them. The inhabiting would take as long as it took. She gave Tamara money, not as much as Tamara protested, or not as little as Tamara suggested, an amount that Diana had calculated with the same methodical honesty she applied to all calculations, an amount that was proportionate to what Tamara had given her over the past 3 years in rides and meals, and the Sunday calls, and the particular loyalty of someone who shows up when showing up costs something. Tamara cried again, and Diana let her and felt nothing but gratitude for a friend who cried easily and meant everything she expressed. But she did not contact Marcus. This was a decision she had thought about carefully and arrived at clearly, without anger, and without the need to perform the resolution of something that had already been resolved in the only way that mattered. She had survived it. She had moved through the worst period of her life with her daughter intact, and her own competence intact, and the evidence, confirmed by a certified assessor in the presence of a federal attorney, that she had handled a genuinely extraordinary situation with accuracy and care. She did not need Marcus to know this. She knew it. Maisie knew it. Constance and Harold and Tamara and Ellison, in his quiet, official way, knew it. That was enough. That was more than enough. The bunker she kept. She would not have been able to explain this easily to someone else, but she didn't need to. The decision was hers, and it was clear. She had Constance handle the formal registration of the parcel as a protected historical site, which was the appropriate designation given the program it had housed and the documentation the government had recovered, and she maintained the property herself, visiting it a few times a year, usually in the fall, when the Oklahoma plains had the particular quality of light she associated with the day she and Maisie had first stood at the hatch. She kept the main room close to the way she had set it up for their months of living there, the cots, the foam mats, the salvaged lumber shelf with a few of the books still on it. She kept the corkboard with Maisie's drawings, the horse pictures, and the rainbow pictures, and the picture of the 3 of them. The secondary chamber she kept sealed. The cases were empty now, removed in the process of the settlement, or their contents transferred through the formal process that Constance had managed and that Diana had watched with care and with the documentation habit she had acquired in the months of handling this correctly. But the room itself remained, the moisture-protective sheeting on the floor, the heavy industrial shelving, the faint metallic smell of 60 years of sealed waiting. She went in there sometimes and stood in it. She thought about 1961. She thought about the people who had carried those cases down the steps and loaded the shelving and locked the secondary door and left the key on the communication panel hook, had left it there in the way that people leave things they intend to return for, not discarding, but not yet retrieving. The key that said, "This is not abandoned. This is waiting." And then the program had been wound down, and the field records had been sealed, and the site had moved through jurisdictions and decades, and the key had waited on its hook for the person who would look carefully enough to see it. She thought about Maisie looking at the communication panel. She thought about the certainty in her daughter's 7-year-old voice. Not those keys, I think there's a key here, in the room. The kind of certainty that comes not from experience, but from a different quality. The willingness to look at what is actually in front of you, to see the thing that is there rather than the thing you expect to see. Maisie had been looking at the communication panel for weeks. They both had. But Maisie had looked at it as something that might still contain what it was built to contain, which was not switches and gauges and dead indicators, but information, orientation, guidance. And she had been right. This is the thing about abandoned doors. They do not announce themselves. They sit in county surplus inventories, and they come up in auctions with reserve prices of $1 because no one has thought to assess what they might contain, because the people who knew what they contained are gone, and the people who come after are looking for something they already recognize. The door that changes everything does not look like the door that changes everything. So it looks like a liability, a problem, a thing someone else decided they didn't need. It looks like a hatch in a dead field that only one person in that auction room thought was worth $1. Diana Calloway thought it was worth $1. She was right. If there is anything useful in this story, any grain of transferable truth from a situation that was genuinely singular, that cannot be replicated and should not be expected to be, it is perhaps this. The moment Diana nearly didn't go to the auction was the most important moment in the story. Not the moment she opened the case and saw the gold bars. Not the morning she called Constance and began the process of doing everything correctly. The moment she almost didn't go, so the moment she calculated the filing fee against her remaining resources and thought improbable things don't happen to people in situations like mine. That moment, and the decision she made when she overruled it, when she said yes anyway, when she showed up anyway, when she put her hand in the air in an auction room where no one else was bidding, was the hinge on which the whole story turned. You cannot know what is behind the doors you don't open. That is the only true thing, and the only thing that holds up to examination. Diana Calloway bought a door in the ground for $1, and below it was one of the most extraordinary things anyone has ever found, below a door in the ground. Most doors do not have that below them. Most doors open onto the ordinary, the plumbing problem, the structural issue, the renovation project, the thing that costs more than you expected and delivers less. You cannot know in advance which door is which, so the only variable you control is whether you open them. Maisie is 9 now. She has opinions about everything, which she expresses with the particular confidence of a child who has been told, consistently, and by someone who demonstrates it, that her observations are worth taking seriously. She has a best friend at the new school, and she reads 2 grades above her level, and she has been to the Oklahoma field twice since the move, once in summer and once in fall, and both times she is asked to go down into the main room of the bunker. She is not asked to go into the secondary chamber. Diana does not know if this is because Maisie is protecting herself from something, or because she has already understood it as completely as she needs to. She suspects it is the latter. Maisie tends to complete her understandings and then release them, filing them in the category of things that have been looked at and known and no longer require returning to. It is a quality Diana has always admired and is working, with deliberate effort, to develop in herself. On the second visit, the fall one, they had come down the steps in the late afternoon and sat on the cots the way they used to, in the warm, leaning light Diana had kept operational because she maintained the generator during her visits. Maisie had looked around the room, the corkboard, the shelf, the main room of the bunker that had been their home, and she had said, and with the directness Diana had learned to receive without flinching, "Do you miss it?" Diana had thought about this honestly. She thought about the motel arithmetic and the peeling sneakers and the morning shifts and the evenings she had walked Maisie to the bus stop in the dark. She thought about the months of living below the ground and the chemical toilet and the generator maintenance and the 3/4 of a mile walk to the road in every kind of weather. She thought about the Saturday calculation that never worked out. "I miss who we were when we lived here," she said finally. "I don't miss that we had to." Maisie had thought about this. Then she said, "I think we're still those people." Diana had looked at her daughter. She thought about, okay. She thought about the Cold War library book, and the key on the hook, and the steady dark eyes, and the peeling sneakers, and the 8 pairs of sneakers now, and the window, and the first fragile early evidence of a child relaxing. She thought about who they were when they lived here. The precision, the patience, the 3-column list, and the research at 3 in the morning, and the willingness to wait for the information to be confirmed before she let herself believe the number. She thought about what it meant that Maisie believed they were still those people. "We are," she said. "We're exactly those people." She reached out and pushed a strand of dark hair back from her daughter's forehead, the strand that still needed pushing back approximately 11 times per day. And Maisie leaned into the gesture the way she always had, the slight, easy lean of a child for whom this particular contact was simply a constant. Outside the hatch, above them, the Oklahoma field held its late light. The wind moved the scrub grass. The iron hatch stood flush with the ground, locked, the same as it had always been. The same rusted iron, the same key in Diana's pocket, the same field. But the same and not the same, the way everything is the same and not the same after the door has been opened, after the room has been found, after the key has been used and the number confirmed and the arithmetic finally worked out. Below the world, in a concrete room that smelled of time and the particular cleanness of a space that has been inhabited by people who took care of it, a woman sat across from her daughter in the warm, leaning light, and they were exactly who they had always been, which was enough, which was more than enough, which was, in the fullest sense of the word, everything. If this story moved you, if something in Diana's decision to show up when she almost didn't, or in Maisie finding the key that had been there all along, or in the image of a woman doing the careful, methodical work of handling something extraordinary with ordinary precision, then stay with us, because we tell stories like this one as often as we can find them. Stories about the door that no one else thought was worth opening, and the person who thought it was. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. We'll be waiting for you.